This is the guidance film then for the reading on the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Students are expected to read their way through the 2 pages, the first one here. As we work through this reading, what I would like students to do is work with their green pen or an alternative colour pen and make notes as we go. I will highlight the text as we work our way through it. The Truman Doctrine then was an American policy, an American law, an American aim. Started in 1947, and it was planned to provide economic and military aid, so money and weapons and, if needs be, soldiers, to 2 countries, Greece and Turkey, because they were threatened by communism. By this point in the Cold War, Stalin is now seen as being aggressive, and America under President Truman, as we have already discussed, is now standing up to him. The Truman Doctrine was informally extended to become the basis of the Cold War policy of containment. So America's policy was to stop the spread of communism, to contain it. The Marshall Plan was the Truman's administration government, their government's plan to rebuild Europe that had been destroyed by war. And in doing this, the belief was that this would prevent the spread of communism. Only poor people in poor countries would be attracted to communism. Wealthy, prosperous countries where people had money and possessions would have no interest in communism. Between 1945 and 1953, the US loaned $44.3 billion to countries in Europe. Now, most of this money was accepted by Western Europe because Stalin in Eastern Europe rejected the Marshall Plan. He did because he didn't want the money, and nor did the Eastern European countries, because he believed that with this American money would be strings attached that would make these countries obliged to follow what the United States want. So Western Europe accepted the Marshall Plan and Eastern Europe did not. The Marshall Plan ended in 1951 and many argued that it was successful. It helped the European economies grow, it prevented the spread of communism, and eventually did lead to European integration. Western Europe flourished and recovered far faster than Eastern Europe. Some key words now. Containment we've already discussed, which was the policy not of getting rid of communism but stopping it spreading, keeping it behind the Iron Curtain. NATO. This was an organisation set up by the countries in Western Europe with the United States to agree to defend each other if they are attacked by communism. So to the Western European countries and America, NATO was a defensive organisation. However, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Stalin would view NATO as aggressive. The Organisation for European Economic Cooperation, the OEEC, was an intergovernment organisation, a group of governments working together to help plan how the Marshall Aid Plan should be spent. The Truman Doctrine then. The Truman Doctrine was the American policy in 1947 of providing economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey because they were threatened by communism. There were civil wars in both countries. It was the start of the containment policy to stop Soviet expansion. It was also a major step in the beginning of the Cold War. By carrying out this policy, Truman was telling Stalin that he regarded him as aggressive. The Greek Civil War between 1946 and 1949. President Truman told his Congress, his government, that the Truman Doctrine was to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. This help was for people who wished to be democratic and free and prevent communist minorities taking over. Truman asked Congress for aid for Greece and Turkey during the Civil War. He argued that if Greece and Turkey did not receive the aid they needed, they would fall to communism. Once they fell, another country would fall, and another. So both these policies are linked to the policy of containment. The second one here, and then subsequent. The process then of containment. The Truman Doctrine was informally extended to become the basis of American Cold War policy throughout Europe and throughout the world. So America sought to contain communism everywhere. It shifted American foreign policy towards the Soviet Union from one of friendship to one of containment. The Cold War was truly underway now. The grand alliance of World War II was over. Germany defeated, Stalin and communism were now the enemy. The Truman Doctrine underpinned American Cold War policy in Europe and around the world, and it endured because it addressed broader cultural insecurity regarding modern life in a globalized world. The Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, or officially the European Recovery Program, was a large American program named after George Marshall, the American Secretary of State, who after visiting Europe decided that Europe needed massive economic help. It was established in June 1947, and it would distribute $43 billion worth of aid to help rebuild Europe. The goals of the plan. The Marshall Plan sought to rebuild a devastated region, modernize its industry, improve the European currencies, encourage trade and cooperation between the European countries, and mean that they would not turn to communism or seek help from the Soviet Union. The Marshall Aid Plan was offered to the Soviet Union, but the Soviets refused to accept it nor allow any of the countries they occupied in Eastern Europe, their satellite states, to accept the help for fear that it would allow American influence. The non-participation of Eastern Europe was one of the first clear signs that the continent was now divided. Western Europe would recover quickly, and the western side of the Iron Curtain would be more prosperous than the East, and this would have long-term effects. The Marshall Plan aid was divided amongst the countries that were taking part, roughly giving equal amounts of money per person, so the countries with the biggest population would have done the best. By 1952, when the fund ended, every country that had participated was stronger than they had been before the war. The plan was that these new wealthy European economies would actually trade their goods with the United States, and consequently America would get her money back. And finally, one of the long-term aims of the Marshall Plan was to encourage the European countries who had gone to war with each other so frequently to work together in order to build for the future. The guidance instructions on the final page. In this video, we will go through the reading and simplify down the reading so students can make notes as we go through it together. Can students please bear in mind that as they work their way through this task, we are looking to identify these 10 questions. So initially we want to know what the Truman Doctrine was, and then as with question 6, what the Marshall Plan was, and subsequently all the other intervening questions. How students choose to present their work is down to them. This is an exclusive list. If there are alternative ways of doing it, please do it. And also be aware that we are teaching you now to learn this information, to memorize it and retain that knowledge. So having an idea of how you best learn is the most appropriate way forward. The end of the Marshall Plan and its legacy. So what did the Marshall Plan leave behind? The Marshall Plan was originally scheduled to end in 1953. Any effort to extend it was halted, however, by the Korean War that was being fought on the other side of the world. Therefore, the plan ended in 1951. The political effects of the Marshall Plan may just have been as important as the economic ones. Marshall Plan aid allowed nations of Western Europe to reduce the discontent of their people, give them wealth and prosperity, and consequently become politically stable democracies. These shared the same ideology as the United States. The communist influence on Western Europe was greatly reduced because these people were no longer attracted to communism because capitalism and American money had made them prosperous. Now, in your books, you need to answer these questions in your preferred style. What was the Truman Doctrine? How did the Truman Doctrine begin? What did the Truman Doctrine change in American foreign policy? What was containment? How was the Truman Doctrine justified? What was the Marshall Plan? What were the goals of the Marshall Plan? Why did the Soviets not accept Marshall aid? What was the impact of the Marshall Plan? And what was the legacy of the Marshall Plan? Extension questions. What was more important, the Truman Doctrine or Marshall Plan? What were the consequences of the Truman Doctrine for the rest of the world? And how do both fit into the wider story of the Cold War?